Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending upon where you're listening from. Thank you so much for being with us today. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I welcome you to our America at a Crossroads program. And of course, we welcome our most special guest, Adam Nagourney, and our wonderful moderator, Patt Morrison. Thank you both for being with us today. These continue to be very disturbing and challenging times, which seem to be escalating as we meet. As families are sitting Shiva in Israel and the fate of the hostages is still unknown, our hearts break and we join in mourning the horrific loss of life. Last week, we heard from Dennis Ross. For those of you who weren't with us, every one of our programs is recorded and you can find it on our website. The link is in the email you'll get after the program. It stays there together with all 180 of our past programs. We have decided to hold another special briefing this Sunday at 11 a.m. Pacific time with Israeli thought leader, journalist, and best-selling author Yossi Klein Halevi. If you remember, he was with us last month discussing the crisis of democracy in Israel, and now, of course, there's a new crisis to discuss, and he will give us valuable insights. He will be in conversation with Rabbi David Wolpe, Rabbi Emeritus of Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, and currently a visiting scholar at Harvard Divinity School. The link to register is in tonight's email. I hope you will all join us for this very important conversation. Next week on Thursday, October 26th at 5 p.m., we welcome former U.S. Solicitor General Neil Katyal, a brilliant lawyer and astute political analyst who will bring us up to date on Trump, the law, and the future of our democracy. He will be in conversation with Larry Mantle. Now, my colleague David Lair for a few additional words. David?
Thank you, Janice. Welcome everyone to America at a Crossroads. We've been fortunate in securing countless guests who are at the top of their game, whether it's Nancy Pelosi, Ambassador Dennis Ross, or Adam Nagourney. They are expert journalists or politicians or mavens in the field who can grapple with issues which erupt unexpectedly. Whether it's war in the Middle East or a political bomb thrower running for Speaker of the House, they are adept and experienced enough to go with the unexpected. That was noticed by so many of you who wrote thanking us for last week's blockbuster programming with Pelosi and Ross. And as Janice mentioned, for those of you who missed one or both of those programs, they were extraordinary. I urge you to view them on YouTube. We have more top-notch programs coming your way. If you saw the screen that Janice referred to a minute ago, you'll see it again at the end of the program, and the listing will be in our emails. David Leonhardt, a colleague of Adam Nagourney, a veteran New York Times reporter and frequent guest here, will talk about his book, Ours Was the Shining Future. It's coming out next week, and it's been described as the clear-eyed, definitive history of the modern American economy and the decline of the American dream. We'll have Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, an expert on authoritarianism, who's returning to update us on where nations at risk stand. Parenthetically, developments this past weekend in Poland look promising. We'll have David Brooks, also of the New York Times, who'll join us, followed by Martin Barron, the longtime editor of the Washington Post, who'll discuss his just-released book, Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. So between next month and this month, we will have covered the New York Times and the Washington Post. There are many more informative programs ahead. Don't miss them. It's now my pleasure to introduce someone who needs no introduction to this audience, the Los Angeles Times Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, Patt Morrison. She's always superb. Pat?
David, thank you. And thanks to all of you who watch this program, who subscribe to and support this program. We're going to be talking about the New York Times. It's the paper of record not only for the United States and in and of itself, but it can be argued that it sets the news agenda for American news coverage and really for much of the world. Adam Nagourney is one of its chief ornaments. He joined the paper in 1996 and became its chief political correspondent. Eventually, the Los Angeles bureau chief, seeing the light and the attraction of the West Coast, the West Coast cultural affairs correspondent, and now he hits the campaign trail again in 2024. But for our purposes, he brings us his new book, The Times, Adam Nagourney, about the period between 1976 and 2016 at the paper of record. Adam, my friend, thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.
What is it about this period of 1976 to 2016 that's so compelling that it commands a book when there are several books about the New York Times in the past, and of course, enough memoirs by memoirists to fill the newsroom over again?
Well, two things. One is that there have been two books in particular that have been excellent. One was Gay Talese's book, of course, and that was published in 1969. And the other was a book by Alex Jones and Susan Tift that focused more on the Sulzberger family. So I think basically there hasn't been much examination of the period from 1979 to the present, with a few exceptions. When I started the book, I was thinking of it completely influenced by Gay Talese, who it's a great book if you haven't read it. Sort of telling the story of a newspaper that I think is extremely important to journalism, to American politics, to American society, and filled with great and interesting characters. What I did not realize when I signed the contract back in 2016 was how the book would end, and that it would end with the newspaper having redefined itself as a digital organization able to make money digitally. So the one thing that this book had that, for example, Gay Talese's book didn't have just because of circumstance is that there is an obvious narrative arc. The story has a beginning, middle, and end. I should point out one thing, Pat. When I signed this book, I did not realize how it would end. And for all I knew, the Times would either be out of business, possible, a greatly deflated version of itself, well, not so impossible. So it kind of has a happy ending, at least in that sense.
And like so many people who undertake these efforts, that you didn't know the ending may have made it more suspenseful and a little maybe unnerving for you as well as you went along and reported it.
I mean, it did, but also more interesting. And I was just thinking it through all the time, and I began to see pieces fall into place, and it was kind of rewarding in the end that way.
The nature of journalism has changed so substantially over these years, and so it turns out to be a fortuitous period of time that you wrote about. But for the New York Times in particular, where you quote one of the former executive editors saying, referring to the paper's credo as the faith of everyone in the defining myth of the effortless superiority of the New York Times. And for so many years, the problems that were internal were kept internally. It was like the paper that landed on your doorstep was the paper that was meant to be. It's like Casablanca was originally supposed to be Rita Hayworth and not Ingrid Bergman, but we got Ingrid Bergman on our doorsteps. But in fact, until so many of the problems went public, there were stresses and conflicts and all kinds of issues within the paper itself, defining itself, its presence in a new century where women, people of color, gays had a distinct presence in the cultural landscape. Can you talk first about that part of the paper and how it struggled to come to terms with really a new America?
I mean, I think that's a big part of the story. The New York Times, when I begin this story, is a very, very white, male, middle class, largely Ivy League organization. And let's start with women first, and we move to gays and lesbians. Women in 1975 had to file a suit because there were so few of them that were represented in the upper ranks of the newspaper, and they were underpaid. They were statistically underpaid. And in one example I write about here, there is a woman named Betsy Wade, who was a copy editor, the first woman copy editor on the news desk. And she was viewed as just excellent. Everyone I talked about her as being extraordinary at what she did. And in one side of this, Pat, the Sulzberger family asked her to copy edit the obituary of Iphigene Sulzberger, who was the matriarch of the publisher. So she was a big deal. And she was one of the women that led this suit against the paper. And she was in an elevator one day with an executive of the paper riding up to the third floor. And he turns to her and he goes, "You know, Betsy, we are not in the habit of promoting people who sue the New York Times." And he walked out of the elevator. Now, Betsy ended her career writing the Practical Traveler column, which I read all the time. It's great, but it's not exactly what you consider a success. And she was definitely punished for this. Now, as a result of this suit, and I didn't realize this until I started reporting this out, a lot of women who you know, Anna Quinlan, Susan Chira, Soma Golden, got jobs at the New York Times because of this suit, that opened the doors to women. Now, it took until Jill Abramson before there was an executive editor who was a woman, but I think that was a big change in the paper. Not enough, but a big change. Blacks, again, the same thing, blacks and other people of color, it was a huge problem. And there, I found a speech that Punch Sulzberger, the publisher back in the 60s, gave to his editors, expressing regret on this and saying that he wanted this dealt with. But again and again, you see editors and publishers saying we need to deal with it. And the numbers continue to be lousy for whatever reason. And I think it's not until recently that you began to see a almost proportionate, I stress, number of Black people and people of color in the newsroom.
We'll get in a little later in the conversation to Jason Blair, who was a promising young Black reporter who crashed and burned and almost took the reputation of the New York Times with him. But also when it came to issues of the gay presence in culture, the question of AIDS, there was a lot of squeamishness on the part of the leadership and management. And Mrs. Sulzberger, Iphigene, whom you cited earlier, she was the tastemaker in the sense of, well, we don't want to offend her. And so stories about gay pride festivals reminded me of Dorothy Chandler, who was the wife of the publisher of the LA Times, who didn't want to see photos of navels or snakes in the newspaper. So, so the squeamishness about issues that were not, as you say, in that mainstream of white, male, upper middle class Ivy League really caused a big reset and a lot of turmoil within the paper, as well as with the outward facing aspect of the New York Times during this period of change.
That's true. I'm going to move 2 inches to get out of the glare. Yeah, that's a little weird. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, part of what was going on with women and with gays just reflected the culture of the Times, small t. And the publisher at the time, Punch Sulzberger, the main executive editor, Abe Rosenthal, I won't deluge you with names, but those are just two worth remembering. They reflected a time in their jokes that were back and forth, that were completely sexist, talking about women's appearances, and in their homophobia. And I always wondered, I could probably establish, with observation, homophobia, but I came across a whole lot of papers, including a private diary that Abe Rosenthal, the executive editor I mentioned, wrote, in which he talked about, he said, I would hire a gay to be, I think he said a theater critic or an arts critic, but I would not want one covering the State Department or the White House, because gay people, form cabals in the newsroom, and they're dangerous and disruptive and all this stuff. I mean, it was out there and it really existed. When two changes took place. When Punch Sulzberger was replaced as publisher by his son had a much different attitude towards this. And he started taking gay reporters out for lunch and saying, you will not have to worry about being a gay person in this newsroom when I take over. And when I interviewed him, Arthur, years later, he said, my father was anti-gay. So it was a big change. And directly to your question, one direct result of this was that the paper's coverage of the AIDS epidemic in New York, right, which along with San Francisco and LA were the ground zero of the epidemic, was really bad. It was not until I think 1983, sorry, even I wasn't around then, that the paper first had a front page story about the AIDS epidemic. So a generational change was really important there.
This is a good moment to point out that this is not an authorized book. I mean, nobody was looking over your shoulder, but that it was approved in the sense of you had access to the papers of Times staffers, oral histories, and other things that would not ordinarily be available. Is that right?
Not sure about the ordinarily. So the first part was that there were archives at the New York Public Library going through about 1992. The editors were required to send their papers over to the New York Times archives. They put it into the public library. Anyone watching this can go there and go through those papers. Now, after that, the paper stopped doing that. The paper ended that requirement to save money, I believe. So every time I interviewed somebody who was a key player, executive editors, I asked them if they had papers they could share with me. And journalists, being pack rats, right? They always did. They'd handed me over boxes of paper that I just went through. So that was really a big part. And then there's a New York Times sort of official historian. I went to her apartment. Her name is Susan Dreyfus. And it was just filled with stuff like oral histories and tapes and transcripts of meetings. And it was just sitting in her apartment. I hope that she's given it over to the New York Public Library. I think she has. But so it wasn't, the New York Times is such this, as you said, seems to come out of nowhere and end up in the old days on your doorstep, like perfect, quote unquote. But it's not as sort of well organized as you would think, because I discovered in trying to unravel the archives and private papers.
Well, considering that, as you point out, journalists are by their nature self-reliant, secretive, insecure, competitive, sensitive, and suspicious, with sprawling egos and high self-regard. This is hurting cats. It's hurting cats in neckties in a newsroom.
That's right. Yeah, newsrooms are really hard. I mean, I think the New York Times is like, I believe, I would guess, Pat, the LA Times and the Washington Post. It's a bunch of very competitive, dysfunctional, talented, often brilliant people. And it just produces this crazy kind of chemistry, especially for executive editors who want to run the place.
One of the reviews have been uniform in praising the book, talk about it as being, I don't know that this is the word that was used, but gossipy. And certainly you write about your colleagues and former colleagues as some of them are kind of lazy when it comes to work. Some of them are not good writers. Some of them, you write about their personal problems, their personal demons. Did that feel a little strange, writing what might have been a profile of somebody outside the paper, but here you were writing about people whom you know or know of?
Well, two things here. One is I don't think it's flipped into the range of gossip. That's not what I would want to do. I saw that review too, and it was a good review. I do try to paint full pictures of the characters so that people can understand these people who are running the paper and putting out the paper. So, for example, again, Abe Rosenthal, I talk about him drinking because everyone talks about him drinking, and he talks about him drinking, and I think that's just part of his character. Because the book ends in 2016, I am writing about people, with two exceptions, who are basically out of the newsroom, who are gone, who are in history. So I didn't have that uncomfortable situation of talking to people I work next to. I mean, that would have been kind of excruciating. And since I've been out of the newsroom, I've been either in Washington or here in Los Angeles since 2002. I'd worked with pretty much all these people, but I never really worked face-to-face with them. So I think that helped a lot in doing this.
Have you heard from any of them about what you wrote?
Yeah, without violating any competences, because I don't think they meant, I think generally they've all been really positive. I got one today, and again, I'd rather not say who it was, and I didn't get his permission, but just saying I felt like you treated me really fairly. And Pat, that's the bottom line, right? I think if people read this book, these are tough portrayals of a paper and people ultimately on a trajectory to success, I would argue, but they're tough. And I wanted it to be fair, and I didn't want it to be salacious. Other books have talked about divorces and drug use and that. I mean, that's just not my thing. I worked for the Daily News, a tabloid in New York. I loved it, but I think I'm more of a fit for staying in journalism.
I'm sure that most of our audience read the New York Times, subscribe to the New York Times. So if you have questions for Adam Nagourney about his book, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to them during the chat session when Adam and I bring your questions into it. And I know among them will be questions about coverage of what's going on in the Mideast right now. And I want to let you know, Adam does not have anything to do with that. He has no special insights or privy to any information about how these decisions are made. But Adam, you can talk as a journalist about some of the challenges of, it's hard enough to cover domestic home front difficulties and conflicts, but here we have the fog of war so many thousands of miles away where everything is fraught and everything is heated. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, as you said, I'm not really comfortable talking about this specific example because I'm not part of it, and it's just not what I should be doing. But I will say that it is very difficult in this changing world to cover stories that are just breaking and changing every minute. You don't have time. Back when you had a print edition, you had time to consider it, unless it was right on deadline. Consider it and edit it and have people look at it, and people take a last look to make sure you have it right. This is different. There's more of a premium on speed now because that's the world we live in. And that, as a result, I think sometimes stories are a little off or headlines are a little off, but I think eventually the paper gets into the right place. It's not gets to the right place. It's not a problem unique to the New York Times, and it's a problem that just I think we have to work out as we move into this new world where speed does matter, where you do have to get stories up, where people are looking at the web. I haven't looked at the traffic. I'm sure it's tons of people just to see the latest developments in the Middle East, but it's difficult. There's no question. I write about, I end the book in 2016. I think there's still a lot of questions left to be answered that will be answered over the next decade or two, which is how the paper adjusts to this new world and still maintains the kind of integrity and commitment to writing serious news that's always defined it. I would argue that so far it's done a good job, but it's difficult, and we'll see how it works out.
The digital transformation has been so difficult for most newspapers. With the New York Times, it's helped to be the saving of the New York Times. But even someone as insightful as Rupert Murdoch did not see coming all those years ago the fact that the internet would savage newspaper advertising and advertising lineage and create real crises. And your colleague Tom Friedman wrote the book that the world is flat. My argument is that the internet is flat. There are some people who take at equal value the New York Times and some website that calls itself news, and that they're supposed to be competitive. Talk about how the New York Times came into the digital age, some eagerly, some kicking and screaming, and how that has changed journalism, you think, especially the journalism at the New York Times.
You know, I always realized this would be a big theme of the book, and I went into it with some presuppositions that the paper was a bunch of older, I can say that, who would, resist it and look down their nose at digital. It was more complicated than that. I'd go through these old memos and I'd find examples of editors like scoffing at the idea of, of an internet, or as A. Rosenthal wrote, well, maybe someday people will get their news off a television screen. I guess now we would say phone, but they'll always want a paper. And you see that, piece of paper to read in their hands. And you see that again and again. But you see people who are stunningly foresighted, way back even in the early 90s and 1980s, who realized where the world was going and realized that at some point, people were going to get their news on whatever the electronic device was. I'm not sure they quite anticipated how that would change the way we tell stories or how we pay for it, but they saw it coming. And importantly for this book, one of the people who was like that was Arthur Sulzberger Jr., who is the publisher during the main course of this history. And he, from the moment he came on, he was talking about how the news business was heading in this direction. It's important to remember two things about him to understand this. One, he began his career working at a wire service, which means he was used to writing a story and have it, as we would say now, posted right away. He was not wedded to this idea that some of us grew up with, that you write a story, you edit it, and then it's in the paper in the morning and blah, blah, blah. The other thing is, and I'm not being funny, he was a Star Trek fan. So he could understand, he would talk about I don't care how my readers get their news. We could beam it into their heads. That's good enough. And I think he was forward-looking enough, even though he didn't understand completely where the paper was going, that he led it that way. The last point I would make is the paper is institutionally conservative, or was. I don't think it is anymore, in terms of change, in terms of things that it's willing to do. It does do things. It has done ambitious things over the years. But in this case, it moved slowly until about, I think, 2016. But it moved, right? And it implemented, most important, it implemented a paywall so that they could figure out a way to pay for the paper. And, I think if you look at your phone, we can even use today as an example, and see the way the stories are being told, whether it's Washington or the Mideast, it's dramatically different than the way it was 20 years ago.
Define how you think it's different, because there was a time when you had people writing exclusively for the website and people writing for the paper, and that's not the case anywhere, I believe.
Absolutely not. Right. The operation was bifurcated at the beginning, right? There were people who wrote for the website, there were people who wrote for the newspaper. It reflected the sort of elitism to some extent. I don't want to overstate it. The fact that some people didn't want to write for the website, but that changed. And now everyone writes for everything. And what I meant by that, though, is, you have your traditional stories, right? In some cases, 3,000 word profiles, or stories about water in the West, which I'm sure you read. But you also have stories that are illustrated with photographs and videos and discussions and all kinds of really kind of cool things that, of course, you can't do with a newspaper. And I read both the print paper and I read it on my phone or my iPad. I don't mean to plug Apple products here, but when I see a story that I know has been really presented, right, I'll look at it on my phone or my iPad. I won't even bother reading it in the paper. And that's the way it's changed. It's a big difference.
And so the nature of the presentation is different, but the nature of journalism is not?
No, I think that's a good point. I think that you still have the kind of New York Times stories that you found 20 years ago, sort of in-depth, hopefully well-written, well-edited, balanced stories. But you also have, again, if you look at the front page during these two breaking stories, you have these live reports. I mean, they keep updating with stuff that's going on every couple of minutes. And that's a change. And that's just a new way of presenting news to people. But the old stuff is still there. And you still find, these great features, I think, all through the newspaper that defines the newspaper. It defines the New York Times today in the way it did 40 years ago.
So these two basic eras that you break the book into, although there are sub-chapters and it's chronological, so it's easy to see how the evolution has emerged. The early days and years of the paper, it seemed to have that voice of God, that magisterial, everything is fine. We're the swan on the surface, no matter what's going on underneath. And that really held the paper back in some ways from a larger readership, perhaps, certainly of portraying a larger culture that was going on, even, resistance. And as I read in some of these pages, disdain for covering people who were living outside the norm, whether it was lifestyles or political attitudes. And you have to think that the kids of some of these people in charge were the ones who were leading this counterculture charge, and maybe that's what fed the resistance to it.
I think that's true. And I think the paper just learned that it had to change to appeal to a wider audience. There still are voice of God stories, I think. I think Peter Baker, our White House reporter, is really good at them. I like them. It's what I was trained to do. But that's not enough. And you'll see different voices. You'll see, for example, after I cover politics, so excuse my bias here, you'll see after a debate, they'll have, instead of an old lead all saying, the candidates clashed, blah, 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 you had 5 takeaways, right? Where you have 2 reporters usually sit down and say, okay, reader, these are the 5 things you need to know about the debate from last night, right? And that's all they'll have. And, on one hand, I'm missing those kind of lead-alls, right? Because I'm old school. But on the other hand, I'm realizing, no, that's what people need. Like if you're waking up in the morning, you don't really need to hear what, anyone said that, I get Pence said that, DeSantis or whoever the candidates are. I mean, it's a really smart way of doing it. And that's one of the changes. I think that's a big change. And you also see stories now organized in a way that are just not your traditional inverted pyramid. They're trying new things.
And to think about some of this coverage too, that when the New York Times of old landed on your doorstep, it might have been the tablets from Mount Sinai. Everything was so set in stone. But again, as you say, the culture demanded changes. But the paper has always been, less so now, certainly, again, the word queasy about it. When Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio got married, you remember this anecdote. The photo editor chose a photo of them kissing, and her mouth was slightly open. And the leaders at the Times were so offended by this newlywed couple, they fired the photo editor. Well, here come, 40 years later, you've got to deal with Bill Clinton in a stained blue dress. And so whether they wanted to or not, they had to come to terms with the culture, as it probably had always been, but demanded to be noticed and reported on now.
Yeah, Monica Lewinsky, that's a great way to focus on this, because that was, in my opinion, a pivot point in the paper's realization of this. I write a whole chapter about that, because at the beginning, the executive editor at the time talks about resisting some of this coverage or being proud of bearing it. But at a certain point, he's sitting and someone brings him a story that includes the detail of the blue dress, which I'm not going to, you know what I'm talking about. And he's like, I guess we have to publish it, right? I guess you have to publish this. And he almost faints. I mean, it's just a big change. And then before you know it, the Times late is jumping on the story and trying to be really aggressive in covering what's going on with all the tawdry details. So Bill Clinton, God love him, was one of the reasons that the paper changed.
There was also a few years before that, the rape case against William Kennedy Smith in Florida, right, where the Times, taking a cue from NBC News, naming the victim, which the Times never did, decided to put the name in a profile that had already been prepared to run about her. And that caused a lot of outrage among the staff and a lot of questions in the world of journalism.
I mean, the thing is, as a rule, back then in the 1980s and even today, you err on not naming the victim, right? Because the idea is she or he has been through enough that you don't have to sort of subject them to this kind of humiliation. The executive editor at the time had problems with that. And he thought, this isn't fair. William Kennedy Smith is getting accused by this woman. The people should know who she is, right? Then when NBC published his name, he walked out of his office and said, okay, that's it. The cat's out of the bag. I think that was the words he used. We're going to put her name in. So they put her name in into a story that was ready to go. And people freaked out the next day. And there was a town hall meeting with reporters confronting the editors about this decision and talking to other newspapers about this. Pat, this was unheard of. This never happened at the Times before. And I think that was actually the beginning of, I track in here about how the newsroom reporters become more of a force in the newsroom than they were in the early days. It used to be like a really top-down paper, but there's a direct line between that and when Howell Raines, who we mentioned before, confronts the newsroom about the Jason Blair stories. I mean, it was a big deal, but that was like, interestingly, the executive editor at the time never thought he made a mistake, but he was chastised by the publisher and the publisher's son for doing that.
And that third voice that entered the mix ultimately with the digital age, beyond letters to the editor, was readers having their say. Readers talking to the newly created public interest editor, public editor, and putting comments on the website, and the nature of the New York Times coverage itself being the subject, not the topic that was being covered. What a tremendous change for the newsroom, a shock for the newsroom that must have been.
Absolutely. And, you know, later on, include Twitter on that. All of a sudden, people are getting attacked or challenged on what they wrote. And I think it was, at first, people kind of resisted it because, like, I mean, this is not me, but like, what do we care what they think? What you kind of referring to what you said before. But after a while, I think they become much more responsive to it. And it was, you know, another kind of fact checking that was going on from the outside of the paper. It's a big change. I mean, you can argue whether it's good or bad, but it is. So.
Then you switch from internal problems to the outward facing, the public problems, which to this day people will discuss as if they know everybody at the New York Times, right? But these were two major stories. One was how the Times covered the outbreak of or the waging of war in Iraq, and then the Jason Blair scandal. And the paper did not cover itself in glory, either in the incidents themselves, or very often in the way they handled the kind of cleanup and explanations of those. So if you can detail first what happened with the Times as seen as a booster to the choices made by the Bush administration to wage the war in Iraq.
I mean, the way the Bush administration tried to rally the nation to go to war in Iraq, this is after 9/11, was by saying that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And that he was a threat to the region, and that he was a threat to the world. And the Times wrote a series of stories that sort of reinforced that point of view, right? And I think it quoted somebody as saying, you know, this is a nuclear disaster ready to happen, or it's really alarmist language, right? And the paper, the country goes to war. And it's in part because of this coverage. I don't want to overstress the Times' influence here, but in part because of this coverage by mainly a reporter named Judith Miller. And the stories began to fall apart. Not all of them, Pat, but most of them. And a lot of them were just fed to the Times by people like Vice President Cheney or his staff. And he would then repeat what he read in the Times that morning on the morning talk shows. So it was really pernicious. And I think it was really damaging. I know it was really damaging to the paper's reputation. And the paper, I think, really screwed up on that, and they tried to fix it by writing stories about what happened. But you know, I think that we're still seeing damage to the paper to this day. The other event that you're talking about involved the serial fabricator, a man named Jason Blair, who just made up a whole bunch of stories. And he had been promoted by the management. Howell Raines loved him. He kept moving up and up. But it turned out
young black reporter.
Young black reporter, yeah. And, you know, it turned out like I got his personnel file, and he had a cocaine problem and a drinking problem. And, you know, he talked to me about like going, you know, saying he was places that he was not, and going to the newsroom and taking a break from writing a story to do some cocaine in the back stairway. And eventually it came out that he had been writing stories, never leaving where he was. And it came out
because it was his apartment, not even the newsroom.
Yeah, in Brooklyn, right? And he was stealing details from another reporter. That's how he got caught. And he got fired. And it was really damaging to the paper. And I think reporters are proud, and that kind of thing reflects on the newsroom. And that was a big reason why Howard Raines and Gerald Boyd lost their jobs. And Sulzberger kicked them out because of that. I interviewed Sulzberger, Arthur Jr., about this. And he said that he thought that Jason Blair was more damaging to the paper than Judith Miller. I actually disagree with him about that. I think that Judith Miller had a more, I don't mean the shorthand, the Iraq coverage, because she had a lot of great stories too, that did more damage to the paper's reputation than Jason Blair did. Even though I have to tell you, to this day, if somebody wants to get under your skin when you're writing a story they don't like, they'll be like, oh, you're just another Jason Blair. I still hear that.
In a way, it's like some of the actions that Donald Trump took. Nobody ever thought of codifying any of this to say, oh, no, you can't do this, because no one ever expected it. No one ever expected that a reporter of the New York Times would make up things and not go out and cover stories and just make things up out of whole cloth. And so there were measures put in place to remedy that. But the subtext of the Jason Blair story is that the paper needed young minority talent, had gone out looking for it. And the question of how he was he treated with kid gloves? Was he given every break? Were people too hard on him? Were people expecting too much of him? We talk about how that ended up really for a time making life in the newsroom very difficult.
I mean, there were elements of that. It was complicated for sure by the racial aspects of it. Gerald Boyd, who was the managing editor at the time, was Black, and people were talking about him as his mentor. I don't think that's true, but I think that Gerald Boyd certainly helped Jason Blair. Part of it was race, no question about it. But part of it was, here was this young go-getter reporter and coming up with the goods. As it turned out, the goods were not real. That's beside the point. And, you know, if you're an editor and you need to get something done and it's a Sunday, that's the kind of person you value. So, you know, when the sniper shootings were going on, there were these shootings involving a sniper in Washington, and the editors were upset that the Times was behind the Washington Post on the stories. They sent Jason Blair down there to try to come up with some stories. And Patty came up with some really good stories that I think were largely fabricated. I mean, that's just the way it was.
Is the institution of the paper now, in the wake of the Iraq coverage and Judith Miller, more skeptical about authoritative sources?
I would say
authoritative sources.
I would say absolutely. I mean, one of the things that was going on was we were coming out of 9/11, and there was a real sense in those first years that the country's under attack, right? That you're expected to be with the country and patriotic. And it was a while before that went away. You could see that in 2004. I'm sorry for forgetting the year. I think it's 2000. It was 2004 when two reporters came up with the NSA wiretapping story. It was a pretty big story at the time. And the paper sat on it for a year because they thought it wasn't substantiated enough. They published it. It was right before the election, right before the November election. They published it a year later. And, you know, the editors at the time told me that they thought it was a better substantiated story. I'm not sure about that, but I do think a year was a long time, and the paper had become increasingly suspect of what the government was saying. And I think that's the right relationship between a newspaper and the government.
Let's start getting to some of your questions. Let's see. There's a question from Stephen about reporting in the Arab-Israeli conflicts. As I said at the top, Adam is not privy to this. He's not done it, so he has no insights. But he did speak about the difficulty of reporting on ever-changing sources and incidents. And Adam, I think that may be as far as you want to go on that.
I think so, yeah. Sorry, Steve. It's a good question, but I'm probably not the right person right now.
Diana wonders whether reporters have become more folksy and personal in their reportage than previously. And it does seem like it's a little less hieratic. It's a little more conversational than it used to be.
Yep.
Yes, yep is the right word.
I wasn't being funny. Well, a little funny. There's no question about it. I think that reporters are trying to write more conversationally. I think the sort of stead voice of God writing that you talked about before, you're pushed away from doing it. They don't want the writing to be distant or hard for people to grasp. So the paper is definitely more chatty. Is there times when it might be too chatty? Yes, I think that's probably true. But mostly it's more readable and more entertaining. I mean, you can read a story like Taffy's story on Taylor Swift in Sunday's Magazine. That's a very, not chatty, but very personal kind of story.
Next month, I'll be talking to Marty Barron, who worked for a while at the New York Times, the LA Times, and then was the editor at the Boston Globe when it won the Pulitzer for coverage of the Catholic Church and incidents about molesting of children. And that, of course, became the movie Spotlight. But one of the points in his book is about the relationship between reporters in appearing in the pages of their publication or online versus reporters in social media. Do you know how the New York Times has handled this? Because some younger reporters view social media as the means of expressing their personal opinions, which readers will not see a difference between that and what they write about for the paper.
And I think the editors of the Times completely agree with that, as I think Marty Barron does. And the instructions are pretty clear that you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to use Twitter to write anything that you wouldn't put into a newspaper story. Use it to promote maybe promote stories or to offer an insight on what's going on, but you're not supposed to do that. And that also is an ongoing struggle. I'd be lying if I said I think that's been resolved yet. I think that's something that we're going through now. In the next book, we'll see how well, I'm not sure I'm gonna be the one to write it, but we'll see how well it's succeeded. But I know that's what the editors and the publisher wants.
An earlier generation of reporters, that would be you and me, we were not allowed to have bumper stickers or political signs or anything like that. So it's another iteration of that. Chris wants to know about the impact of Substack, the proliferation of blogs and podcasts, whether other people are looking to other places to get their news. Now, part of what you and I know is that some of these other places take off on the information that they see in mainstream newspapers like yours and mine, but people who are reading the web, as I said, the internet is flat and they don't know that that's the case. So what has the impact been of this online competition when the Times for so many years was focused on competition from other papers?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. For a long time, the competition for the New York Times was the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And that's changed. I mean, that's still true, but we're very aware of Substack and blogs, and that's been going on for a while. It has definitely been a big change. It's a broader field, but the other thing is some of them don't use the same standards that the Times does in deciding what's okay to print. So you have to be careful not to get pulled in that direction.
Let's see what else we've got here. Marion, how much coverage should the New York Times give Donald Trump? I guess that's more dictated by circumstance than by choice, although choice certainly must figure in it. When you look at CNN and in 2016, how CNN used Donald Trump as money-making wallpaper.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair criticism of CNN. Trump is a big story. He's a huge story. He's a very important figure in American history, and the paper gives him tons and tons of coverage. And I think you always have to balance off what is coverage that's sort of adding to the discussions, telling you new things about Trump and this man who was president and who might one day again be president, versus just putting up there so that a million people will read it. I think it's a struggle that every paper has sort of has faced. There were complaints, and again, I don't want to get too much into this campaign, but there were complaints that there was too much coverage of Trump back in 2016. I understand that. On the other hand, look who was president for the next 4 years.
Has anybody come up with any plausible formula for how to cover this man outside of or recreating or extending the boundaries of the kind of classical political journalism that you and I both know?
I mean, I think that people are trying to do it because the old rules, the old playbook did not work. And I think that people are trying to figure out new ways to write about him, which means more skeptical coverage and I think tougher coverage and maybe not as much coverage. The thing, Pat, to your point, you normally don't write about people running for president who just kind of lie. I don't think I'm exaggerating here about him. And that sort of challenges the system. It just does.
And there was a great debate about whether to call them lies at all.
Right. That was something that Dean Baquet was struggling with for the past 4 years. It was a struggle.
This is the man who is the editor at the end of your book, who before That's that correct. Was the editor at the LA Times. Wendy wants to know about the future of print and the New York Times. We've seen so many newspapers go entirely digital in order to be able to afford to go on being newspapers. Is this at all in the future of the New York Times?
Well, when you put the question like this, I think that's possible. I think we're going to have the paper version for a while. It still has a lot of readers. It still makes money. The paper still makes money from print ads. So it'll be a while. But do I think that the print edition, the daily print edition of the New York Times will still exist in 10, 15 years? Maybe not. So, and eventually, no. I mean, I don't know about you. I'm reading most of the paper, not all, but most of the paper on my phone now. I just think that's
I like
not all.
With that, well, it's around now. The paper's more like this than what it used to be. Like
that
helps, right? But still, it is an old-fashioned notion of cutting down trees and making paper and printing things on them and putting them on trucks and delivering them. Amy wants to know whether you think the paper went out of bounds when it started Wirecutter. It seems like a commercial move beyond the realm of a newspaper. And part of that goes into that consumer service aspect that for years the Times didn't do at all.
Right. Or, it's interesting, if I can go back in history for 1 second, the paper was facing a bit of a crisis back in 1977 because you remember the urban doom loop? I mean, that was going on back then too. So people were leaving New York City, advertisers were leaving, and the paper needed to do something to reinvent itself. And what it did was, and this seems a little small fry now, but it created the living section and the food/dining section. And there was a lot of resistance to that. and it was a resounding success. And it brought in advertisers, and it brought in readers. And Abe Rosenthal, who had resisted it for a while, looked at it and said, "I just wonder why we didn't do this earlier." So with this stuff, so Wirecutter, cooking is another example, games. I think that the Times has become, it has 10 million digital subscribers. And part of the reason is it's more than just a newspaper. You can still find news on the phone, every day, but you also have these other things. And everyone I know uses NYT Cooking to cook, right? I'm not good at games, but I have lots of people who go to Wordle every day. And I think that is part of the package that the paper is offering. I want to be clear, I don't think it's at the cost of the news report, but it's part of why the paper's marketing, I hate that word, is broadening the way it is.
You had that audience 50, 60, 70 years ago. Maybe they only wanted the sports section or the crossword, but they had to buy the whole paper to get it, which they don't now.
That's right.
You can subscribe piecemeal. Let's see. Paul, how do you handle, this is a quandary that often comes up in this forum. How do you suggest people handle the proliferation of false and fake news and AI on social media when fewer and fewer people read the daily newspapers, which to some extent are an antidote to that?
I mean, this will sound kind of obvious and self-promoting, and it's not. I think you want to read papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times that has systems in place to guard against that. I mean, there's so much fake stuff on the paper and on the internet now, and certainly on Twitter, X. And I'm just much more cautious in what I look at and what I believe. And it's going to get worse with AI, as you know. So again, the advantage of these established legacy brands, if you will, is that they do have systems in place to guard against this. Of course, they're going to screw up. Stuff's going to get through, but that's generally the direction and priority.
And I always put in my plug when people ask what they can do to help newspapers to buy an online subscription to the paper from your hometown or the capital in your state so that local journalism gets some support too. Ed wants to know the ratio of profits from digital versus paper subscriptions. That once mocked digital.
Yeah, I'm a little reluctant to answer that because I don't know it off the top of my head. I think it's 50-50. But it's mainly, I know most of the revenues are now coming from digital. I just don't know how much more versus newspaper advertising. I just don't know the exact number.
I'm sure you get this a lot. SW wants to know about what you think of the Times dropping its sports department in favor of the Athletic. There's probably no non-political topic that's gotten so much heat recently as that one.
I talk a lot at these appearances about how the period of change that we're in, it's sort of hard to figure out what means anything and what doesn't. And one thing I learned in doing this book is that the distance of time for perspective, I'm answering your question. This is not like a political answer. The distance of time, the openness of characters who are willing to talk to you, access to documents, help me, I think, really talk about and put in perspective Judith Miller, Jason Blair, all that. So I look at events going on now, and this is one of them. And I wonder whether when someone comes along in 10 years and does the same book post 2016, and I hope someone does, what they're going to make of the sports thing. I don't know, but the one thing I think is it's almost certainly going to be a chapter. It's going to be something. It's hard to tell.
Michael has a question. It's personal, but I want to expand on it in some way. He says, you live in LA by choice. How does that impact you in your work? And especially as you live out here, how much New York and Washington are a news black hole. They suck all the energy and reportage into them. And as you get farther and farther from New York and Washington, the sense of coverage and of really connecting with what the country is about tends to dwindle to the point that journalists are mocked for dropping into diners and interviewing people eating pancakes to get 2 or 3 quotes that they use to summarize the state of the nation. So maybe you can talk about that journalistic geography.
I mean, let me talk about LA, for example, because I think that's a really good point. I always wanted to come out here. I found it was a great place to work. There were colleagues that were like, why are you going to LA? In fact, some people here said the same thing. Right now, the last numbers I saw, we have more digital subscribers in California than we do in New York. There's a huge market out here, and I never found any shortage of stories, and whether I was covering news stuff or culture stuff. So I think this is a really important part of the world. I think, again, the newspaper, the world is more focused on Washington and New York and the rest of the world. And that's something you just have to deal with all the time. Like if you're in Washington, you're going to write 20 stories a month, maybe. Here, I might have written 8 or 9 stories a month. So that's the difference. But I think it's still important to the Times and other papers as well.
And do you think that attitude is changing at all, or is it just the fact that the reins and the nucleus are Washington, New York?
I think it's changing a bit. I think that people realize how many readers and interesting readers are out here and want to read the paper. So I think it's changing. But look, the world will always be, the news world will, at least for a while, be anchored in New York and Washington. That's something we just have to get used to.
Stephen asks, and you touch on this a little bit, and of course it's also in the Gay Talese book and in Meyer Berger's book of 70 some years ago about the New York Times, about the Sulzberger's Jewish heritage and how that has brought attention to the New York Times, how it may have affected coverage of the by the New York Times, and of course the public accusations that are still leveled at it.
Right. You know, it's interesting. I thought about that. It shows how much the world, or at least the Times, has changed, that wasn't as much a theme of this book as it was for the Gay Talese book and the Berger book. You know, obviously the publisher now is no longer, you know, he wasn't raised Jewish, so he doesn't consider himself Jewish. And I don't think people look at it as a quote unquote Jewish newspaper as much as they once did. So it's not as much a factor as it was at the time.
Judge Joe asks, and since you're going out on the campaign trail, you may have thought about this, how you assess the Times coverage in 2016 and 2020, the difference between them?
I'm going to pass on that just because I feel it's a little bit out of my subject area. I end the book with the 2016 campaign coverage and criticism of the paper for the focus on Hillary Clinton's emails and the fact that it wasn't prepared for her to lose or Trump to win, however you want to put it. But I give me a couple of years before I feel comfortable contrasting 2016 to 2020.
Okay, you're going to be on the calendar, Adam. So
I'll take it up. But I do think, you know, this goes to a point I was making before. I think this paper and every newspaper learns from its mistakes, or if it gets things a little bit wrong, and eventually ends up in the right place. So I think they were just trying to figure it out back then, and I think they eventually ended up in the right place, or will by the time they'll be back on the show.
Mina says, we're seeing writers giving their opinions on MSNBC and CNN. Does that cross a line? And I think that here we need to make a distinction between news reporters with beats providing information and opinion columnists. Is that fair to say? I
think that is fair. I mean, if David Brooks goes on, or Brett Stevens goes on and offers his opinion on what's going on in the world, well, that's what he does for his column, right? That's perfectly appropriate. I don't think reporters, I mean, I feel very strongly reporters should not go on television or anywhere and offer their opinions on stuff. They can offer insights, right? Or points of view, but not like, you know, I think abortion's good, I think abortion's bad. But, you know, maybe some insight into the motivation of why Joe Biden is doing what he's doing. But again, you make a really good point. People should be careful not to mix up a reporter with what a David Brooks or a columnist is saying.
You make a point about David Brooks, who tweeted about a very expensive airport meal that he had and got a lot of pushback from it, which again, just because of the nature of digital and everything else, would not have happened 50 years ago. It would have brought some sage nods, said, yes, airport food is very expensive, and isn't it a shame and a sign of the economy? So maybe that's the lesson that all reporters take from these digital interactions with their readers. And at a big newspaper, unlike a small one, you don't run into the people you write about in the grocery store, but the social media has become the grocery store, I guess, the grocery store aisles for that.
Yeah, I'm not sure David realized that before this, but I think he certainly has realized it now. I mean, the reaction to that was pretty brutal.
At the end of the book, you write about what lies ahead from that 2016 ending is striking the balance, protecting the newspaper's reputation as an even-handed news source while catering to a concerned and politically activated audience and increasingly outspoken staff. Is that happening now? You think it's on the way up? I think that's the process the paper is in every day. I would argue that it's doing a pretty good job walking that line. I think the big question outstanding is how it sort of works through that over the next 5 years. But right now, I mean, you can see it you can see it all the time. The paper sort of balancing the demands of its readership, its paying readership now, with what has always been what made the New York Times the New York Times. And I think it's doing it pretty well. But again,
it's a process, right? It's still in formation, and it'll be a while before it's resolved.
When I was planning what I would be asking you about, I thought of two movies, and they're very different movies. One is Firestarter with Drew Barrymore as a little girl, and the other is Robert Redford in 3 Days of the Condor, but they both end the same way. The principals are threatened by their own government, the CIA, some murky agency, and the last scene is of them standing in front of a building and someone telling them, "You're going to be safe now," and the camera pans up and it's the facade of the New York Times. Is it still that New York Times?
Well, I'd like to think it is. It's not quite like when I began this book, the Times, the history. I mean, the Times was this like voice of truth and the moderator of what's right and what's wrong, and it had the field largely to itself, not completely. Obviously, the LA Times, the Washington Post, but largely, and it had this kind of stature that no other newspaper had. And now, 40, 50 years later, it's not quite there, as you said before, whoever that questioner said before. There are blogs out there. There's fewer newspapers, but there are blogs out there and Substacks and tweeters or Xers and influencers. So it's not as big a deal as it once was. And I also think it diminished to some extent by some of its own actions, including the Iraq coverage and Jason Blair. But it's still a big deal. I mean, I'm stunned by how many people read it. I'm stunned by how sometimes people treat me just because I happen to work there. It's still a really big deal. I don't think there's any other newspaper quite like it in the country. And that's what I was trying to capture in this book, like why that is and why it succeeded in the face of all these odds over the past 40 years.
And so can you expand that out in the minute we have left and say anything hopeful about the future of American journalism generally for newspapers?
That's a tougher question. I can talk about the future of the New York Times more hopeful. One downside for a second, I think we'll see more and more diminishment of newspapers just because of the way the market's changing. I wonder if there is an appetite for people to pay for subscription for more than one digital newspaper. I hope so. I certainly hope the Washington Post and the LA Times, which are, in my opinion, great newspapers. I think the New York Times is on track to success. I mean, it's like it has 10 million digital readers now. It's making money. It looks great. It makes mistakes, no questions about it. It's still working out what you asked me about a second ago, which is to what extent are they sort of understanding and catering to their readers' needs versus to simply doing what is right. I took some solace in the fact that the Times wrote a long series of stories about water in the West Coast. I mean, I doubt that got a ton of clicks, but that's the kind of stuff we should be doing. And I think that's where the paper's going.
Adam Nagourney, the book is The Times from 1976 to 2016, critical years in the American journalism and in the paper of record. Adam, thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it. That was a pleasure.
I want to let you know that next Sunday, an unusual day, there'll be a briefing here on this program at 11 a.m. There you should see it on your screen with Yossi Klein Halevi and Rabbi David Wolpe about the crisis in Israel. We'll be taking, of course, your questions as always, and this is a vital conversation at a vital time in the history, not only of the nations involved, but of the world. I'm Patt Morrison. I want to thank you for joining us here. And to the extent you can, please support these programs so we can keep bringing them to you. Thank you. Good evening.